Now we are going to turn our attention to the future of corporate communications and its shift from a cost center to a value center. This is a big question, and so we're going to anchor the discussion in research that Edelman just launched. To have this conversation, we have Adam Collins, who is Chief Communications and Corporate Affairs Officer for Molson Coors, and Jim O'Leary, Edelman's U.S. Chief Operating Officer and Corporate Affairs Practice Chair. Welcome, my panel from Chicago.
Hey, Arthi, thanks for having us.
Right.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Arthi.
Yes, and you're both in Chicago today, right?
We are indeed.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So we have 5 takeaways that we're going to go through. So we're going to move quickly because I want to get to all 5. So Jim, let's start with you. And very quickly, I know the last time that Edelman conducted a survey like this, it was like 2014. So why did you all decide to conduct its sequel now? Because nothing major in the world has happened in the last 18 months.
Right. Well, that's why we decided to conduct the sequel now, because a lot major has happened in the past 18 months. So yeah, I mean, when we originally set out to do this research over 6 years ago now, we were primarily focused on benchmarking kind of like what the typical corporate communications organization looks like and focuses on and does. This time, when we set out to do the research, we wanted to determine what has changed since then, and more importantly than that, or equally importantly, what the future holds. And as you can imagine, given the events of the past 18 months, we have some really interesting findings, which I guess we'll get into a little today.
Yes, we will. And Adam, I want to give people a little bit of context from your point of view as well. So you were part of a reorganization at Molson Coors about 2 years ago. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, the company used to have 4 business units and a global structure that sat over that. And communications, depending on which business unit you were in, or if you were in the global administrative section, was very different. So in the US, there was a CCO. There was my predecessor and predecessor before him. We had a really strong base here. But in a lot of the business units, it was scattered. It was either paired with legal or reported to legal, or was sort of split up throughout the business. And so, my role within Molson Coors sort of came to be through the reorg 2 years ago.
Okay, and this gets us into the first point, and that's about sort of how the CCO position is structured. And Jim, one of the takeaways from the research was that the role has become materially more important to CEOs and boards. And I will say our own research also bears this out. According to our Influence 100, 72% of CCOs now report into the CEO or chair. So I guess, Adam, as part of your reorg, you now report into the CEO. Previously, the function reported into, was it HR and legal?
It was legal. Yeah,
Okay.
legal from the global CEO. There was then a number of different functions, and comms ultimately reported in through legal. Like I said, the US was a little different, but I think it's a recognition. Like I think I'm really lucky. It's a recognition of within our business of the important role that communications plays, not just in doing things, but in actually achieving business results. And that's how we look at it. And that's what we're here to do every day.
And I think that's a good point that you say that you consider yourself lucky, because it's not all roses. Jim, I'd love for you to speak to one of the warnings in the research that stood out to me, and that's significant variability exists in the perception of communications as a business driver, depending on the industry or organizational maturity. Jim, can you give some more details around that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, so look, over the past 18 months, we've seen a number of things that have dramatically influenced the importance or perceived importance of communications, right? Those things are all the obvious things like the pandemic, social racial justice movement, geopolitical tensions. There are also some of the more macro trends that have existed prior to the past 18 months that have just been exacerbated. Most companies are in some state of transformation, technology disruption, climate, et cetera. All of these things together have shifted the perception of the function away from its more historical perception as like a support function, or some would even say a cost center, to something that's much more strategic business partner or value creator. And what that has meant in terms of the CCO role in our data is that, back when we did the first set of research over 5 years ago, only like a third of the CCOs were reporting directly into the CEO. And now, as you pointed out, with your data also shows now it's more than half.
So before we go on to the second point, Adam, I would like to just sort of revisit this one more time with you. I mean, was there any sort of education that you had to do internally to say, hey, look, here's why, or the case that you had to make to say, here's why comms should not be reporting into legal, here's why it should be direct to the CEO. And did you get in, and what kind of resistance and questions did you get around that?
You know, like I said, I'm very lucky. Our CEO, I think, is someone who sees the power and the benefit of communications and what's possible through really good communications. But it's certainly, it's a mindset shift for an organization. You know, you think about teams who are used to thinking about what communications does. I mean, you know, we're not the Twitter people. We're not the, you know, PR people. We're not the people who take a decision that someone else has made and then write a nice memo about it and distribute it out. That's not what we do. That's not the value we provide. Because if that's all we did, we'd hire some you know 22-year-old people out of J school, and we'd fill up a team of people who have good grammar skills and things like that. I think the value we provide is understanding we're the one place where everything else in the organization comes together, right? To tell one simple story. We're the people who have the best line of sight into that, and the best line of sight in the context in which the world in which we're operating. And so we have the, I would say, singular ability, I'm sure people disagree, singular ability to help actually move our core audiences to do something, to believe something, to feel something, whether that's employees, whether that's customers, retailers, if that's investors and analysts. That's our role. Our role is not to write the tweets and pitch the stories. Our role is actually to deliver business results. And if I can, Artie, real quick, it's a mindset shift, not just for others in the function. It's also a mindset shift for people within the communications team as well, for all of us, right? As we move from this approach where we think of ourselves sort of as ticket takers to ultimately to decision makers. And that's the sweet spot for communications.
So I love that point about, you know, going from being a ticket taker to a decision maker. So on that note, I will get to point 2 next, but Jim, I just wanted to get your take on sort of how should the comms role be involved in operations and policy setting? Do you think there should be a convergence with sort of adjacent functions like government affairs or sustainability?
Yeah, I think there already is a convergence with those functions, and I'm sure Adam can talk to what it looks like at Molson Coors. But you know, the trends that are driving the shift in perception around communications are all things that are oftentimes, or most oftentimes, interdependent with other functions, right? So what we've seen in terms of workplace, workforce, and employee engagement more broadly, like there is a partnership with HR that is required in order for that to work, right? What we've seen on the ESG front and the role that business plays in society, like there is an intersection, of course, with some of the other functions as well in that front. And then what we've seen in terms of communications helping enable business transformation. I mean, all of these things can't be done in silos. All these things, in order to drive business value, you have to be, you know, be closely connected to and linked into the business.
If I can jump in there, Artie, that's all right. This is danger when you give comms people microphones, right? Yeah. But you know, you've got to elbow your. It wasn't a big challenge for me, right? Because our CEO saw the value of what communications can do and believes in it. But I know that's not the case for everyone. You've got to elbow your way to the table, right? Ultimately, you know, you can't allow decisions to be made within the business that you can foresee are going to be problems for the business. And if people don't see it, you've got to help them see it. And if ultimately they don't value the work that you do, I'm sure they value you as a person, but if they don't value the work that you do in communications, you ought to update your resume and go find someplace else to work. Because I think what's happened over the last 18 months has certainly been transformational within comms and how businesses and organizations look at the value we provide. But it's sped up a transformation that was already happening. I think there are a lot of organizations who are ahead of the curve on that, and they'll be much better positioned in a very competitive landscape.
So I'm gonna have us go on to point 2. Well, good point, Adam. I'm determined to get us through all 5. All right. So the second finding in the research is the modern communications function is agile, multidisciplinary, and insights driven. So I'm curious, you know, what do you mean by multidisciplinary? Are we advocating that comms oversees marketing? And the second question I have is, you know, well, I guess that would be my question for Jim. And Adam, I know Molson Coors has a CMO, and I'm just curious about how, you all work together, and some sort of context around this. Sort of, I was looking through our Influence 100 research, and I was surprised at the number of sort of qualitative answers we received, basically predicting, which is, it's been going on for years, but it feels like it's ramped up in the last few years, the inevitable merging of comms and marketing. All right, so Jim or Adam, Jim, you go first.
Yeah, I'll start and then Adam can build on this. So we are not unilaterally advocating for communications to take over marketing or vice versa. If it makes sense in certain circumstances, either way, then certainly if it's best for the business, then it should be done. But what we mean by communications is shifting to be more multidisciplinary, agile, and insights driven, is that when we started off, many of us started off, Adam probably and I, much of the communications function was filled up with people who were former journalists, really good writers. Adam already touched on this earlier. And what they did really well was media relations, employee communications, and a number of other things. Now, and then heading into the future, you're just as likely to maybe someday see a comms tech team within a communications function as you are an employee communications team. Now, that's not today. We are increasingly seeing communications analytics teams. We're increasingly seeing insights and advocacy teams that are built within communications functions. And sometimes these include data scientists and people with different skills than maybe communications practitioners traditionally had. And so that's what we mean. And then, of course, insights driven is the fact that now with digital tools, data technology, you can measure things that were previously impossible to measure. You can demonstrate value and ROI in ways that was previously unquantifiable. And all of that, of course, is just another thing that has helped communications, corporate communications in particular, move up the value chain.
Yeah, I mean, from my end, I'm glad that Jim's not getting me in hot water with our entire marketing function. Our CMO is fantastic, right? And they do work that is distinct and different than what we do. And when you think of communications, but in order for those two things to work together, we have to partner really, really closely, and so we do here. I have the brand PR team sits within communications here and has for quite some time. And the team probably spends more time working with the marketers than they spend working with what you think of when you think of corporate comms, right? But the reason that structure works, I think, is because we bring a unique perspective into those conversations, and ultimately it helps deliver the best results for the business. And so it's a partnership that I'm really proud of, and I think we've got a good path forward here between the two teams.
So one last question on this piece, Jim. The research points to sort of the T-shaped people. I think the definition is professionals with deep expertise in a particular domain, but enough breadth of skill to think strategically and plug into various contexts, right? There was this moment where sort of the dream comms hire was, savvy at media relations. They managed leadership expectations. They could shoot video. They understood social platforms. And the disaster in that ask became evident very quickly. The T-shaped person isn't reminiscent of that.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think that as with everything, it's going to continue to change and evolve. And where things are headed, I don't think that our research found where things are headed is a surprise to me, but I do think that the average communications team, average communications function still has a long way to go to get to where it ultimately needs to and wants to. And, Adam can talk more specifically maybe about what he's done within his own team and with his own function to drive that evolution. But I do feel like when you think about what is now expected of communications, given the increased pressure on the C-suite, some comms teams are able to deliver. Some comms teams still have a long way to go in order to meet those new expectations.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to sort of the first point, which is we don't need to be the senior most doers in the organization, the people who are best tasked with executing a decision that someone else has already made. What we need is to view ourselves as strategic advisors, as people who can understand what's happening inside the business, what's happening inside the world, and can help guide the business in the right way and help think more clearly about how to navigate the dynamics of the industry or the marketplace. And so to me, it sort of ladders right back to that. We need to have that view of ourselves just as much as everyone else needs to have that view of us.
So I want to go on to point 3, which is about comms tech and how communicators can use technology to deliver quantifiable value to the business. And Adam, I actually want to start with you on this question and ask you sort of how your function is evaluated by your CEO.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a great question. And I think when you look back at what we've gone over the last 2 years, there isn't like a particular data point that you can evaluate how we've navigated a pandemic versus the last time how we've navigated a pandemic, right? But we look at things like employee experience, right? Are people feeling like they understand where they fit into the business, and that they can show up prepared and ready to go succeed, no matter what part of the business you're in, whether that's geography or function, right? Same thing with customers. They feel like we are there to help them succeed, that they understand where we're driving our business from a strategy standpoint. Those are the types of evaluations I think that we've got. And I think the reality is right now, and I'm a big believer, my background's all in politics, right? So I'm a big believer in polling and in data and in constant data, and give me as much data as you can, and I'll, go look at it and whatnot. I think the reality is, given the landscape that we're in and the changing dynamics every day, you wake up today, it's different than it's going to be tomorrow, it's going to be different next week and a month from now. You've got to be pretty nimble, and you've got to just stay close to your core audiences and understand how people are moving, where they're moving, why they're moving, and continue to adjust. And I think so. I guess it's a little bit of, so it's not as fine as I'd like it in terms of data, just given the reality of the world right now.
Right. It sounds like reputational benchmarking sounds like a big part of sort of how
For sure.
you're
Absolutely.
And Jim, do you want to, I have 2 questions for you on comms tech. So do you want to start with sort of how sort of comms tech can help our industry be evaluated more quantitatively, it sounds like?
Yeah, sure. So, what marketing has done over the past 7 or 8 years is what's coming next for communications, right? In terms of using digital tools, tech, data, analytics, et cetera, to quantify the value that they provide to the business. On the communication side, it's a little bit different, of course, and it's all about determining the application that's specific to the piece of communications that you're talking about, right? And so we're increasingly seeing, for example, the use of comms tech in crisis management, right? Or even more than that on the employee engagement, employee experience side. Significant use of tools and tech to both engage with the workforce, segment the workforce, target specific elements of the workforce, and then measure shifts among the workforce. And more broadly, what we've seen in terms of using primarily on the data side is we're starting to see companies that, like on the marketing side, they're using data to model business impact. And so connecting communications activities with shifts in market share, connecting communications activities with shifts in market cap, things like that. That kind of econometric modeling, which has been increasingly common on the marketing side, was not until recently being employed on the communication side, but we're seeing that change.
So to your point about so much of Comtech is being applied to crises, right? We live in a world today where there's 4 billion people using social media on sort of 8+ platforms, right? You add disinformation and misinformation in that mix, and brands are really sort of exposed to the dark corners of the web. So, I mean, right now, how much of Comtech is being spent sort of tracking what's sort of happening in this chaotic digital sphere? And when something, how much should brands be paying attention then to something that is sort of bubbling up on some Reddit channel, right? That has the potential to damage a brand's reputation in the long term.
Yeah, well, so that's a number of different questions right there. We could go on at length about misinformation, disinformation, and what that's doing for the business and our profession. I'll actually take a different part of your question, which is you're asking about where CommSec is being used or where the spending is occurring, right? CommSec essentially in the not too long ago was primarily around monitoring things, monitoring social, monitoring media, et cetera. And then it started to shift to include monitoring and targeting, or monitoring and measurement. But I think for a long time, on the measurement side, no one was ever really achieving the holy grail of being able to directly link the communications activities that the function was doing with the business outcomes. Certainly there was a linkage between shifts in perception and all of the stakeholder-based research that everyone's been doing for some time. What we're increasingly seeing now with CommSec is the spending is shifting towards the quantification of communications impact on the business. And that shift has allowed the people who do measure that to, of course, go in and demonstrate more measurable value for the function, similar to how marketing does, than communications has historically been able to do.
So we'll go down to number 4, employee comms. Unless Adam, do you want to say a little bit more about sort of how you all sort of make your comms tech investments and where most of that investment is at the moment?
Oh, no, and I don't really want to give away the playbook to everybody, you know. I mean, but what I think, you know, the thing is when you're looking at some of this stuff, you know, you've got to remember what you're about and what you're driving towards, right? I mean, I think, you know, whether it's data, whether it's technology, whatever the case, the crisis du jour, whatever's going on at the moment, you've got to remember who you are as an organization, what your brand is about, and what you're trying to accomplish, and figure out how to get from point A to point B while navigating whatever's happening right now. I think too often people fail because they get way too in the weeds on something and they totally forget where they're actually trying to go.
All right, so let's go to point number 4 here. Employee communications is not a pandemic fad. So I'm curious about this one because I've had some conversations with people where, you know, they seem to hint that sort of the emphasis on employee communications will sort of shift once we're sort of back. I think someone called it a recession economy. And according to our Influence 100 research, again, employee engagement and change management were a major area of spend, I think for about 35% of respondents. And that's already down from about 45% in 2020. So Jim, I'm curious if you're seeing sustained investment in this area.
Yeah, so we are. I think, look, the focus on employee engagement, the focus on the workforce, while it may not be as great post-pandemic, should we enter a post-pandemic phase anytime soon, it is going to remain. And it may ebb and flow, but it's not going to, like where things were 10 years ago, it will never go back to that. The focus on employee engagement, I think our data suggests that 2/3 of the people who run communications organizations at the 250 companies that we had conversations with, 2/3 of those people thought that the investment would be sustained post-pandemic.
Adam, can you walk us through a little bit about empowerment? Go ahead.
It's not even close to me, right? I mean, employees are your core audience. And that's not a pandemic phenomenon. It's a reality, right? If we have 18,000 people around the world who work for the company. If they don't believe in our future, if they don't understand what they're being asked to do every day contributes to the company's long-term success, if they don't understand what the company's doing or why the company's, investing in a certain area, whatever, how excited do you think they're going to be to wake up every morning and come into work? That's true no matter whether it's a white collar job or a blue collar job. If you work in a brewery in Golden, Colorado, if you work in a corporate office in the UK, it doesn't matter, right? We're all human beings. We're not robots. And so I think it's really important that we continue to build belief and build confidence among our employees, because ultimately, if employees aren't engaged, if employees don't believe, then the business is going to suffer.
So we have about 6 minutes left, so I want to make sure we get to point number 5, which is the big one, and that's expectations around social issues have shifted the agenda, and there's no turning back. I think we're all on the same page there. One of the recommendations was, develop a consistent framework for engaging and responding to social issues. And I was curious about that because there's such an unpredictable nature to social issues, and there's a lot of nuance that has to be factored in. So Adam, I wanted to start with you and ask you if you all sort of have that a framework, and if you could sort of walk us through that.
I mean, and this goes back to a point I was making a little earlier. To me, everything has to start with understanding who you are and understanding what you're trying to accomplish. That is the main criteria for any decision that you're going to make, right? And so if there is social unrest due to decades and generations of racism sort of coming to a head, okay, well, what are your values? What do you want people to believe about you? If you don't know that, you're going to go off and you'll write some bland corporate statement, and it'll look nice, and everyone will see it on Twitter or Instagram and pat themselves in the back, in the comms team. Sorry, but then in reality, you've made no contribution for the organization or for your customers or for the world. So you need to understand what you're about. Who are you? What are your values? And if you don't know that, none of the rest of it makes a bit of difference. I caught myself. I was going to swear, but I didn't. But none of the rest of it makes a bit of difference. And so to me, everything has to come back to that. We 2 years ago, not quite 2 years and a half ago, we had a horrible tragedy. We had a workplace shooting in Milwaukee where we lost 6 of our team members at a brewery. It was awful, right? And then shortly thereafter, everyone in the world fell into a global pandemic that we're all still dealing with. And in the middle, you've had racial tension, you've had political tension around the world. And all through all that, as we look at how we're going to communicate, what we're doing, what actions are we deciding to take, those are driven by our understanding of our values, understanding the context that's happening in the world, and then we can make smart decisions. And that is why it's so important for comms to have a seat at the table. Because comms is buried 3 levels down in some other function, and you're not there to provide that counsel, to give that understanding to people. Sure, the right decision might get made, but more than likely it's not going to be, and it certainly isn't going to be informed.
Jim, the second, very, very well said, by the way, Adam. So that second point, recommendation and the research was gain stakeholder buy-in and conduct regular tabletop exercises to ensure that your process results in outcomes consistent with your values and goals. And Jim, am I hearing what Adam just said, am I wrong to read this a bit cynically? There seemed a bit more about consensus than values, but I'm sure you can give it a bit more context.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that we said values in there, right? And so essentially what you just read was, a less eloquent way of saying what Adam just said.
So what would you say about, to your point about, what Adam's saying, about there are so much of these social issues are so, there's so many layers to them that really it's quite difficult to take a framework, right, and just apply that to something like, racial tension, politics, to climate change. There's just too many different, most of these issues have sort of decades or more background, and they hit people quite differently, right? So tell me a little bit about how you think a framework would work and apply to some of these issues.
Yeah, well, look, so what Adam is referring to could be the framework, right? Like, here are our values. Here are how we're going to determine what we're going to do on this issue against our values. That would be a framework. I don't think it's like some type of machine that you put in like the situation du jour and it spits out the statement and action the company's going to take in order on the issue.
Right.
But like, look, without a framework, whether it's your values, which I would hope it'd be part, be aligned with your values, or whatever else you want to include in the framework, you're literally going to be dealing with something every single day, and you're going to have to be recreating it from scratch, right? And so if we are in a world where the number of issues that are facing our CEOs, the C-suite, et cetera, like they're more than they've ever been before. And if you don't have some way of having thoughtfully thought through how you're going to at least think about addressing the issue or speaking out on the issue or not speaking out on the issue, then you're just going to be, indefinitely twirling. So
we have about 1 minute left, and I do want to ask you, we're in this moment, right, where it's time to show receipts, right, around purpose. Consumers are looking for bravery. So what should brands be willing to show for their purpose? I've heard everything from, sort of accepting that 1/3 of their customers may always be sort of unhappy, but that it's not about, to your point, Jim, about achieving consensus. It's about sort of being guided by your values. So I'm curious if both Adam and Jim, if you wanted to say, what should brands be willing to show for their purpose?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and this is sort of echoes what I had just gotten to, right? You've got to understand who you are as a reality. Where has your brand been, right? Not everyone is Patagonia, whose everything was founded on this notion of sustainability, right? So you've got to understand who you are, and then you can figure out where you fit into the world and what areas you think are real for consumers. People aren't stupid. They'll sniff it out if you're just making it up. Consumers will, and so will your employees too. So you've got to understand who you are, and you've got to understand what's real to your business, what impact you can make in the world, and then you can start having a conversation about how to fit in with purpose.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, right? It's about authenticity, as Adam was saying. And then it's also about, more than just words, right? And it's about the actions that you take in order to prove out whatever, you're saying.